Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for being here. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to talk about former Governor Tom Salmon, who passed away yesterday. While I didn't know him well, I know he served during the nation's most challenging times. His efforts on behalf of Vermonters are worthy of our gratitude, remembrance, and respect. My thoughts are with his family and friends during this difficult time. Today, we'll be talking about public safety in our package. But first, I'd like to talk about how my team will approach this legislative session. Last week, as you know, I outlined my vision focusing on affordability by improving our demographics. And I believe the best way to do that is by bringing more housing online and reforming our education system to make it more equitable and sustainable while providing better outcomes for our kids. I also believe we need to make real progress on public safety. As well, we should take another look at last year's climate policies because Vermonters can't afford what's been done. So this year, my team will introduce 4 separate bills to address housing, public safety, education, and affordability. This will make it easier to understand the what and why, track changes, and follow it through the process. The way we've done it over the past is a more scattered approach. Hasn't worked that well, leading to confusion and accusing us of not being fully engaged, which couldn't be further from the truth. With larger, more broad bills, it's my hope committees will hear testimony on the entire package, understand all parts of the plan, and give legislators the full picture of what we're trying to accomplish. Like we did last year, we'll give you regular updates on the status and direction these bills are heading. As I travel around the state and talk to Vermonters, concerns about public safety are growing. We see it in our cities and towns, in the news, and on social media. We're also seeing it in our more rural communities as well. It's important we do all we can to make sure the actions of a few doesn't leave any lasting harm on our communities or state. Tucker and Jay will go into more detail in a moment, but these proposals will cover 3 key areas. First, to increase accountability for those who break the law. We see too many arrested and then released the very same day without any real consequences. We need to create a culture of accountability on the part of the criminal and reinstill trust in the system. Second, too much of this behavior is done by repeat offenders, some with dozens of prior offenses, many times while released on conditions from a prior arrest. Third, we'll continue to push back against increased illicit drug use and its effect on our communities. While we've made some progress, and as I mentioned in my inaugural address, overdoses are trending downward, but there isn't a time, or this isn't a time to celebrate because there's still much, much more work to do. And finally, recognizing the evolving work of the Department of Public Safety, I've submitted an executive order to the legislature to elevate the department to a cabinet-level agency. Vermonters are asking us to do something to make their communities safer, and I'm hopeful that legislators will partner with us this year to make it happen. So with that, I'll turn it over to Tucker Jones from the Department of Public Safety. Tucker.
Thank you, Governor. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tucker Jones with the Department of Public Safety. As the Governor mentioned, public safety remains a persistent issue as we enter the 2025 legislative session. Reports of certain property and violent crimes have risen throughout the pandemic, and this has exposed some gaps in our criminal justice system. Communities continue to voice frustration about crime in their neighborhoods. These frustrations are rooted in fact. According to data from the Vermont Intelligence Center, 2024 was the 3rd consecutive year with more than 20 homicide victims in Vermont. Our data doesn't go back far enough to tell us when we've last had a streak this long with that many homicide victims. We've seen a similar trend with reports of aggravated assaults. According to data from the National Incident-Based Reporting System, reports of aggravated assaults increased 40% through the pandemic between 2018 and 2023. Reports of property crimes have seen some of the greatest increases during this time frame. Reports of thefts from motor vehicles, thefts of motor vehicles, identity theft, and shoplifting have all more than doubled between 2018 and 2023, according to National Incident-Based Reporting System figures. From 2022 to 2023 alone, reports of shoplifting increased 40% in Vermont. This is a concerning trend. In response to these trends, communities around the state have been holding special meetings on the topic of public safety throughout 2024 and into 2025, even this very week in Barrie. We have been following coverage of these meetings closely. One of the main themes of these meetings is continued frustration with individuals who repeatedly commit crimes while on pretrial release for other offenses and face no timely consequence, despite repeatedly violating court orders. These frustrations are borne out with multiple examples of specific cases. For example, over 1 year, one individual had 230 law enforcement encounters, 69 arrests, more than a dozen arrests for violations of conditions of release, and 35 active criminal court cases. With this record, this individual was released again by a court. There are multiple examples of similar circumstances covered by the media over the past year. In light of this landscape, policymakers may conclude that defendants should face a more significant risk of pretrial detention when they repeatedly commit crimes and violate court orders while on pretrial release. This may be the case even when policymakers fully consider the rights of defendants, including the presumption of innocence, defendants' liberty interests, and the applicable constitutional standards. With an impartial analysis of these cases, we are clearly not striking the right balance between protecting communities from ongoing harm and serving the liberty interests of a small group of defendants. Some steps were taken last year on this topic, including Act 138, but specific gaps remain. We propose this year to clarify the circumstances in which a defendant should be detained pretrial for repeatedly committing crimes and disregarding court orders. There are various legal mechanisms to achieve this, but we are proposing to clarify the legal standard for bail revocation within existing constitutional limits. We also recognize that some of these crimes are committed by individuals with substance use or mental health disorders. And as a result, the policy conversation necessarily includes our colleagues in other state agencies to ensure people are receiving the treatment that they need. But we cannot take a laissez-faire approach to those cases either. Doing so is a disservice not only to the communities that are harmed, but also the defendants themselves. We are focused on empirically effective interventions for these individuals, following the well-established principles of swift, certain, and fair consequences. There is room to apply these principles more effectively pre-trial in the supervision of adjudicated cases, and also for young people in our juvenile justice system. So in the coming weeks, we hope to collaborate with key stakeholders and policymakers about these issues and build consensus on these policies together. And with that, I will turn it over to Jay Johnson, who's with us remotely. Thank you.
Thank you, Tucker. So I'm sorry I can't be there with you today, but I'm here to give you a high-level view of our public safety policy proposals. As the governor mentioned, we'll be doing this in a single omnibus package, and I look forward to the legislature taking it up. Like every year, our package is intended to address the public safety issues we know our communities and our constituents are facing. As you've heard, Vermonters want accountability. They are frustrated with what they view as a catch and release system, and they believe untreated drug and mental health issues to be behind much of the crime and disorder they experience in their communities. First, this year we're going to propose repealing Raise the Age for 19-year-old adult offenders and reform our youthful offender procedures to ensure accountability. In April of 2025, if the legislature takes no action, 19-year-old criminal offenders will be treated like children in a family court. And because they have reached the age of majority, there is no way to hold these young adult offenders accountable for compliance with their family court conditions of release. Vermont would be the only state in the nation to increase the age of juvenile jurisdiction to 19. This is not evidence-based policymaking. This is an unnecessary diversion of DCF resources from the younger age groups where these resources are most needed and making the most impact. We're also proposing changes to the youthful offender procedures to return to accountability for those receiving the benefits of a youthful offender designation and to make a more timely connection between offense and consequences by keeping youthful offender cases in the criminal court as sealed proceedings. Second, we're going to continue to address the issue of repeat offenses. As Tucker alluded, we will seek to revise current law on revoking bail to make it a tool courts and prosecutors will actually use to hold violators to account. We need clear bail revocation standards for defendants who reoffend while out on bail or repeatedly violate conditions of release. We are proposing to update our standard to meet the test for constitutionality articulated by the Vermont Supreme Court. We are again proposing universal sealing of criminal records to replace our current practice of erasing them, when otherwise known as expungement. When a record is sealed, a person who is not reoffending still has the opportunity to pursue better jobs, higher education, obtain loans, or lease an apartment, but leaves those records available for criminal justice purposes and all legally required background checks. Third, we will look to limit the authority of courts to suspend criminal sentences for repeat violent offenses. Many Vermonters might be surprised to learn Vermont courts can and do suspend the sentences of violent criminal offenders. This means an offender could be convicted, receive a sentence of 30 to 40 years for a violent crime, and be released into the community by a judge, despite repeat offenses and supervision violations. We propose limiting the ability of a judge to reduce or suspend the sentence of a person convicted of more than one violent crime. Fourth, waiver of extradition. This is a little weedsy, but the Office of the Attorney General reports 50% of the extraditions requested of Vermont are for the return of people who have already voluntarily agreed to waive the right of extradition. Our proposal would allow law enforcement to return fugitives from justice if they have waived extradition as a condition of release in another state. We need to redefine recidivism to more accurately reflect returns to incarceration and create additional measures for successes as well as for violent reoffenses in Vermont. And finally, on repeat offenses, the 2024 pretrial supervision program for repeat offenders was implemented in Orleans County at the end of last year, and we're hoping for some outcomes data and considering our options for expansion. As Tucker mentioned, the last plank of the governor's public safety policy package recognizes the need to protect communities from the harms of drug and alcohol addiction. First, we seek to repeal the July 1, 2025 prohibition on continued transport of disorderly and violent individuals who are impaired by drugs or alcohol to corrections facilities. Second, we're coming up with a drug treatment strategy to more effectively reduce drug use. Meaningful action on crimes like retail theft requires effectively connecting addicted offenders to treatment and long-term recovery. We're working to build a system that can deliver a swift and sustained connection to addiction treatment and recovery by retooling and reinvigorating existing systems. Our goal is to provide individuals with a seamless transition from one level of care to another into successful recovery. Ideally, this will include connections to recovery housing and employment resources. As Tucker mentioned, we need these strategies to work pre-trial for offenders. These levels of care can be paired with the AG's drug treatment diversion program known as Tamarack, conditions of release, and pre-trial supervision. This system could also include comprehensive treatment, which includes therapy within the correction system to create a new and effective pipeline for successful treatment and recovery for convicted offenders. And those are the wave tops. Back to you, Governor.
Thank you, Jay. We'll now open it up to questions.
Governor Alice Emmons, Corrections Chair, said that in their first meeting that more incarceration will mean spending more money. Do you agree with that? And are you ready to propose more spending for corrections?
Well, it depends. I mean, I know our correction system is stressed in terms of labor. That's a consideration that we have to at least be aware of. But it's not a one-for-one provision. I know that some feel, we spend a lot of money for corrections, and that they do the math, divide it, the amount we spend divided by the number of people incarcerated, and come up with a number, a per daily amount. And that's really not accurate because we have the system that's there. We have the infrastructure, and we have the people there that are there anyhow, and open beds and so forth, and open cells. So it's not really, a one-to-one match, and if I'm making that clear. It is more burden, but not a lot more money, depending on the size of the correctional facility. So it has an impact, but public safety is important. We heard that time and time again. I think we're hearing it from the general public. They want to feel safe.
Governor, what do you make of the argument of some, including the chair of House Judiciary, that says the deterrent to crime is a swift and timely consequence from when the alleged crime happened, and that changes that were made to the judiciary, funding, the court backlog, all of that was done last year, needs more time to work before going down any new policy, passing any new bill?
Well, I think the general public has a different opinion on that. They're demanding action. So we think this is timely. We feel that we should be doing something, as I said, and giving some consideration to the general public's fears. So having a community that is safe is something they expect and something we should deliver on.
How much unused capacity is there in Vermont prison?
I don't know, but I'd be happy to find that out and get you that information.
But you presumably have assurances that it's enough for
what?
For all the people that you're saying.
Well,
living in
hopefully
jail
this is going to be a
instead of on the
deterrent.
streets?
Remember, it's not all, incarceration, it's deterrent. Holding people accountable might lead to fewer people actually being arrested, doing some of the crimes. So I think there's that component that's hard to measure, and we won't know until we do it. But there is a deterrent there. If they're not held accountable, there's no reason for them to comply with the law.
What will an agency of public safety be able to do that the Department of Public Safety is not able to do right now?
I'm sorry?
What will an agency of public safety be able to do that the Department of Public
It'll
Safety?
be the same. It's just a recognition of the elevated amount of work there. I mean, it's when you look back 20, 30 years as to what the Department of Public Safety did then as to what it does today in terms of emergency management. We've seen it, over the last 2 flooding events. We saw it during Irene. That's grown significantly. Fire safety as well, cyber crime. There's just all kinds of things that would lead us to want to elevate it to an agency. It's strictly, there won't be any added workload in some respects. It's just a recognition of what they've become today.
Governor, can I just throw something in there too in response to this concern about overburdening prisons? While there might be a bump in detentions initially, when people don't show up for court, they have absolutely no incentive to actually ever show up in court. If they continue to commit crimes and there are no consequences, they really have no incentive to stop committing crimes. Once you put those people in jail for detention pre-trial, There is an incentive to settle. That doesn't mean those people will eventually end up in jail, incarcerated, but it will move cases. There are other things that move cases, and the fact that there is no incentive for defendants to show up in court is actually a problem and part of the backlog. So we feel like some of these changes will actually make a difference for purposes of settling out cases and disincentivizing repeat offenders in the community.
Tucker?
Yeah, just to add that, the population of individuals who are committing the number of offenses that I was referencing in my original comments is relatively small. One of the themes that we're hearing in any given community is it's often 1, 2, 3 people who are having a disproportionate impact of police contacts, arrests, and violation of court orders in that community. And so there's that aspect too, that we're not talking actually about a large population of people. We're talking about a relatively small group of people who are causing a disproportionate harm in any particular community.
But raise the age, you mentioned repealing that. I guess what would be the pitch to Democratic lawmakers, because whether it's the pro tem Senate Judiciary Chair, there's a lot of top Democrats that have been trying to get this through and aren't very happy with the delays that it's had, and they still the majority while you do have newfound numbers. I guess what's the plan with that, because they don't seem to have much of an appetite, at least when I've talked to them recently, about repealing raise the age.
Well, a lot of it is in terms of a facility to house them, because we don't have one now. And we can't intermingle them with a younger population. So it's almost like we need 3 tiers. We need juvenile facility, one for moderately juvenile or moderately adult, and then one for adults. And so we're having a tough time with a labor force to take care of the others and the money to build facilities. So that would be my push, is let's let our judicial system settle out. Let's try some of these approaches so that we can deter crime, and maybe they wouldn't be ending up in this situation.
You talk about the intersection of drugs, mental health, homelessness. I'm thinking recently in Burlington, I think the gentleman's name is Mike Reynolds, over 1,800 interactions with the police. One of the big barriers there is like Phoenix House, for instance, in Burlington, closed. Can we expect to see more money in your budget for either designated agencies or halfway houses, sober living, et cetera?
Well, again, I'm not going to get ahead of our budget. We'll be presenting that in a couple of weeks. But suffice to say, we understand our limitations. We understand that we need more facilities. We need more mental health. And so we're going to be doing everything we can to satisfy that. But again, the general public, the safety of the general public comes first, from my standpoint.
And where is your thinking on what's the word for it? Involuntary commitment. We've seen a number of, I think there were 2 high-profile murders, one in Montpelier, one in Enosburg, where there were individuals with mental health issues that authorities knew about, but these people were living in the community. Do you see any changes on that front?
I'm not sure if we address that in this package. I don't believe we do, but I'll look to Jay to respond to that.
We have made some changes it's not in this package, you're right, Governor. Last year and this past calendar year, our Department of Mental Health has been working on regulatory changes to ensure that we can do involuntary medications at additional facilities. I think this is the approach that we have been given the choice to take by the legislature. Otherwise, it gets fairly bogged down in the healthcare committees. I think it's a question that we can get you more information on from the Department of Mental Health, but that is the direction that we are trying to move.
I think, as you remember as well, when I first came into office, we established a pilot program to embed mental health folks within the state police, and that was successful. So now we have, I believe, we have someone embedded in all of the facilities all the barracks at this point. So I think that's been a good approach and has provided beneficial results.
The Corrections Commissioner reported yesterday that the state's prisons are at 135% of capacity, and I know that advocates are also thinking about an increase in federal immigration detainees entering our prisons with the impending administration. Will this package include any additional resources for DOC, or is there a concern about the overlap between these policies and what might be coming from the federal government?
Well, again, I think we're talking about a small number of people here, and we're hoping that it'll be more of a deterrent than anything else. So I believe the system can accommodate this, and if not, we'll take different approaches. We'll figure that out as we go.
Sorry if I missed this earlier, would your proposed legislation make bail revocation compulsory under certain circumstances?
Jay, did you hear the question, or Tucker?
I did, yes. No, it wouldn't be compulsory, but it's an additional tool that prosecutors and courts can exercise that they are not exercising now.
So how would this legislation compel them to consider that option?
It will not compel them to consider the option. It will make existing law a more useful tool. We hope that they will use it. You can't actually compel the courts to impose bail or to revoke bail. We are hopeful that they consider the standards and the tools that we are putting on the table and use them to address the issue of repeat offenses in our community.
Can you give us a real life example of what that looks like? This bill gets enacted into law. What is now before the person making these decisions that wasn't there before that might have them arrive at a different decision about what to do in a specific case?
Well, so Tucker can speak a little more to this, but the intent is that the existing law is not clear with respect to standards. So prosecutors and courts are not certain about using it because they are not certain about the constitutionality of using it. So what we're trying to do is change the law to create a standard that we believe is consistent with the Vermont court determination. Vermont Supreme Court has weighed in on this issue, and then we hope that by virtue of that, it will be a tool that courts and prosecutors start using more. Tucker, you want to speak to that a little more?
Just explain to Joe and Jane, right? How does this work, and why do you think it's going to result in?
The way I characterize it is really at a state level, we have to have clarity under what circumstances someone should eventually be detained by a court for repeatedly violating court orders. Right now, we don't have much clarity in this space, and that's somewhat unique to Vermont. Other states, the federal government, have very clear standards. When you've been released pre-trial after committing an alleged offense, what will result in you being detained if you go on to commit another offense? Vermont, for the last 30 years, hasn't had a very clear standard. And as you know, we've been able to get by over the years because there's only been perhaps 1 or 2 people a year who would completely disregard court-ordered conditions of release and go on to commit multiple other offenses. We're in a slightly different environment now where there's, instead of 1 to 2 people a year, it might be half a dozen, or more who are committing more egregious repeat violations, sometimes multiple times a day. And there's no real top-down instruction about under what circumstances it's just too much, and under what circumstances we really cannot tolerate anymore someone continuing to commit crimes multiple times a day. So that's the goal. I gave that one example. It's an egregious example where someone has 35 pending court cases, and they go on and get arrested again. And all of those court cases have conditions of release. And they go, and the court imposes conditions of release again. And right now, the kind of de facto policy of the state is to wait until someone's behavior escalates to the point where they commit a felony act of violence. And it's at that point, currently, that we step in and say, actually, pre-trial detention should be on the table here. There are a select group of cases in which the intervention point should probably be earlier. And that's what we're hoping to discuss with the key legislators and stakeholders in the coming weeks.
DCF data shows that there's far fewer youth in their custody than there once were, that the probations they oversee are relatively flat since Raise the Age went into effect. I guess what is the data that you would point to show this needs to be repealed because it's a matter of burden to DCF?
Well, again, it's the what ifs. In the facility I talked about, what kind of facility are we going to build and where are we going to place it, and who's going to staff it? It's just that middle type of incarceration of a facility that can handle these 18 and 19-year-olds. That we can't put them in with juveniles, and we can't put them in an older population. Tucker, is there anything I'm missing there?
No, that's the most of it. I just add that, when Raise the Age started, we were listening to theorized benefits of Raise the Age from originally the academics. And it's been several years now, so we're no longer at the stage of theory. The real question is, how is it going on the ground? And the two sources of information that are key are the social workers who are working these cases and the deputy state's attorneys who are prosecuting them. And so feedback from them at this stage is key. And so that's one of the things I think would emphasize is it's now the time to listen to those who know how it's actually going in practice. And so that'll be subject to conversation in the committees.
Ethan smartly is paying more attention to institutions than I am, but he referenced the Commissioner of Corrections testifying to institutions yesterday, saying that DOC is oversubscribed right now.
Because of staffing?
But the fact will remain that they don't have space for additional.
Yeah. Again, I believe holding people accountable will be a deterrent. There's nothing holding them accountable now. They can continue to reoffend, and they can continue to get released. So why would they do anything different? So if we can hold them accountable, at least until they've been tried, as Tucker had talked about, I think that will provide a deterrent for the future. I'm not envisioning that there's going to be some mass incarceration here. We're talking about a few in every community, a few in Burlington, maybe a few in some of the other larger communities, but I think there'll be a deterrent that we have to pay attention to and will be helpful and will give comfort to at least the community who don't understand why we're just letting them go and reoffend dozens of times. So when you talk about the one offender, how many times, what was it? Interactions, I think you mentioned it.
35 active cases, 230 law enforcement encounters, 69 arrests, more than a dozen arrests for violations of conditions of release.
John Q. Public doesn't understand what we're doing, and they think something's wrong with the system, and we're trying to address that.
All right, we'll move to the phones. Ed Barber, Newport Daily Express. All right, we'll move on. Keith Whitcomb, Rutland Herald.
Hi, I was curious if anyone has had a conversation with the judges themselves or gotten some information from them on why they're making these decisions, if there's such a disconnect between what they think is best and what the administration of the legislature or the public thinks should happen. Like, do we know anything about what they're thinking?
Jay or Tucker? Jay, did you? I don't know. I think she's frozen. Okay.
I can answer.
I didn't see that.
The judiciary, I mentioned earlier key stakeholders, and the judiciary is at the top of that list to have these conversations with them in the coming weeks as the details of these policies get ironed out. So they're going to be at the table from the beginning on this.
Thank you.
We'll go back to Ed Barber, Newport Daily Express.
Yeah, hello, Governor. My question's being off topic. You came to Orleans County last year as part of the cabinet for a day. and you visited North Country Union High School, which had a major PCB problem. To date, they spent $8.5 million on remediation, but the school board isn't sure if they're going to be able to keep B-Wing. They might have to get rid of it and start over. The question I have is, when the PCB issues came up, the legislature allocated some money for testing and remediation, which wasn't nearly enough. At some point, are you going to consider putting a moratorium on testing until you actually have a plan of action how to move forward so that you don't spend $8.5 million in a building that might be torn down in a few years from now?
Well, thankfully, we have Julie Moore here who can explain that further.
Thank you, Governor. Thank you, Ed, for that question. So you are correct that there was never sufficient funding appropriated based on the level of contamination we anticipated. At this point, we have tested about half of Vermont schools, and roughly 30% of them have at least one classroom with levels of PCBs in indoor air that exceeds the public health standard. And so we are working through with the resources we do have to address those concerns and to allow those classrooms to be returned to service. I reflected to folks at North Country Union High School that as much as they don't want to hear it, and as much as I hate to say it, that the B wing of the school is the reason we were doing the testing program, and that there were multiple classrooms that exceeded an immediate action threshold in terms of the concentrations of PCBs. So we look forward to continuing the work to remediate and mitigate the known sources of contamination, and certainly integrate this work more fully with a larger conversation about school construction, and have been having those conversations with the Agency of Education.
Above federal levels, did you say? 30% above federal levels? Or state?
Above state levels.
Kevin McCollum, 7 days.
Hi, Governor. Can you hear me?
Ken.
This is also off topic. Lieutenant governors with backgrounds in construction have sometimes gone on to be successful governors. And I wonder if you think Lieutenant Governor John Rogers might someday make a good governor, and why?
Well, that would be up to him, obviously. But I think he has all the attributes. He comes from rural Vermont. He understands the struggles of declining economic opportunities in some of these forgotten communities. So I think that his sensitivity to that, the rural nature, his farming background, I think it all leads to good things, to at least be able to feel what Vermonters are feeling. So with that in mind, we'll, at this point in time, I think he'd do fine. But that's totally up to him. And I think there's a long ways away before he makes that decision.
Yeah, he's still settling into the role, for sure. But I wonder what you think about some of the hot water he's gotten in over the years with his, shall we say, less than diplomatic responses to colleagues and constituents who've criticized him. He's got a bit of a temper.
Yeah, I've seen that once or twice when I was presiding over the Senate. But you know, he's maturing, he's learning, and I think you'll see that he's much more sensitive to that at this point in time.
Okay. And finally, he has said that he'd like to be a bridge between your administration and the legislature. The previous lieutenant governor, I don't think really served that role. I don't think you guys had a very close working relationship. How do you see John Rogers being that bridge, or do you see that, and if so, how?
Yeah, I mean, I think he would do a great job in terms of working with us, working with the legislature, being that bridge. So we will utilize him in that capacity and in any way we can. So, yes, I think you do a good job of that. He certainly understands the legislative process and understands my views as well.
Thanks very much.
Keith Whitcomb, Rutland Herald. All right, back to the room.
Hi, yeah, I'm here. Sorry, I forgot to unmute it. I was just curious. I know a couple people who live in hotels right now with a voucher program for the cold weather, and I've talked to a handful of people who unfortunately are sleeping outside in this cold. And I was just sort of curious. They've been asking me if there's going to be any kind of help for them come spring when that voucher program ends. I know there's various efforts to get more housing units online, but you're looking at longer than before the end of March here. I'm just curious, is anybody thinking about that, talking about that, what these people are going to do when that happens, or what?
We're still looking for opportunities for more emergency congregate shelters. So in the case of, let's say, Rutland in particular, there's a move forward. We're hoping that at some point we'll be able to open up another facility there. And we'll continue to make strides in opening up more, again, congregate emergency shelters so that people have a place to go.
Thank you.
All right, back to the room for any final questions.
Governor, you mentioned drugs, narcotics, public safety. There's been a bill to roll back the clean heat standard. Would you ever think about a bill or a proposal to roll back the safe injection site bill?
Well, as you know, I vetoed that bill last year, and it was overridden. So it's somewhat in their hands. I think that money could be better spent in other areas like prevention or treatment or recovery. But again, that was the will of the legislature, and I think they'll have to come to their own conclusion as to whether that was the right thing to do. I still don't think that it's what we need in Vermont. I think we need resources in other areas that we know have been helpful.
You may not have an answer to this, but you came out pretty early last session expressing your concern for 687, which ended up becoming the Land Use Act 250 bill, depending on how people say it. I know it's still early, but are there any bills, I guess, within the first week and a half that you've heard of that whether pique your interest, that concern you, or things along those lines?
Yeah, well, we'll have some ideas as well, and that'll revolve around housing. So there'll be an omnibus bill on housing that may include some of that.
Well, I just mean in general, not just housing. Like, are there any bills that have been introduced?
Just, I haven't seen, honestly, I haven't seen them at this point in time. I'm sure you're all keeping track of that, but I'm not aware of what's been introduced.
Pete's reported previously that pretrial detentions in Vermont are at an all-time high. I guess who are those folks and who's not captured in that number if we have seen such a increase?
Tucker, are you aware of?
I'm not really privy to the DOC numbers that you're referencing. I just kind of reiterate that the population that we're focused on is a relatively small one. And so we aren't anticipating any substantial changes that would be a result of this particular omnibus bill or any others that we're aware of.
As lawmakers in this building contemplate next steps on climate and energy policy, one of the outstanding questions is the governor going to come to the table with something serious about new government policy to transition away from fossil fuels? Is there anything going to be forthcoming from?
Well, we'll continue, Julie, if you want to comment further, but we obviously are concerned about that as well. And we'll continue to do all we can within our means to have some effective policy that we think is meaningful.
Yeah, I just would reflect, I think it's important to look at the resources that are currently being invested and the importance of continuing that robust effort. The Vermont Climate Council is submitting a report to the legislature today with an update. Included in that is a compendium of the different investments Vermont is currently making in climate action. And frankly, I was astounded to see it totaled more than $500 million last year alone. Some of those are multi-year programs, like Solar for All, that will stretch over several years. But the dollars being invested in climate action in Vermont is significant and needs to be factored into conversations about how we move forward. I think at times it ends up being, there's this sense that we're either doing a lot or we're doing nothing. The fact of the matter is we are doing a lot, and we are focused on maintaining that level of effort.
How much are we spending on climate? What's the number?
Our best estimate is in FY25, we invested more than $500 million. Some of that is federal funds, or much of that is federal funds, including initiatives like Solar for All, some significant expansions of our home weatherization programs that were made possible by ARPA. And so really our focus is both on finishing the successful deployment of these really extensive resources, as well as looking at how to maintain that effort.
Governor, are you committed to having Vermont remain tied to California's Clean Car Rule?
To what?
California's Clean Car Rule?
Yeah, I mean, we at this point, we are. I'm concerned, to be honest with you. I've heard many stories from folks, and I know that it isn't. We're not mandating that, like larger vehicles, we're not mandating that they have to be electric, but there's a certain component. The industry had to fall into place, and they have to build a certain number of vehicles, right? Let's say, I don't know what the number is, but maybe it's 20%, and that's not the right number. But let's say it's 20%. So what's happening in some areas, dealers and manufacturers are telling their dealers, you have to take these. We're not sending you any more of these diesel. You're going to have to take these electric ones, and they can't sell them. And it's elevating the costs of the diesel ones because they're in short supply, and some folks are just going to other states to buy them. So it's having an effect on us to the extent, I don't know how far, but it's something that I'm concerned about, especially with the trucks in particular.
So it sounds like you're sort of rethinking the wisdom.
Well, I just think we need to be aware of the ripple effect this may have on our economy, as well as the livelihood of Vermonters and all the work that we have to get done. And we just have to make sure that we're fully aware of that. And I don't know that we are.
But so are you committed to staying in until the model year 2026 rule kicks in?
Unless there's a change of some sort. Now they're facing, I'm sure California's facing the same kind of hesitation that maybe we're hearing, but time will tell.
Governor, California just today announced that they're withdrawing their waiver request for heavy truck zero emissions.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, just found that out an hour ago.
That's good news.
I was going to say
that's good news. That's the issue I was talking about. So must be they're listening.
Governor, you mentioned the Global Warming Solutions Act, Clean Heat Standard, and the like. The bill to repeal Clean Heat Standard this year might not have the votes. We've got the Global Warming Solutions Act, a potential lawsuit, a decision from a judge, regulation from ANR. Where do you see this train headed, and what this will mean for
I have no idea at this point in time, but we'll have to let the legislative process work its way through. They'll have to take a vote on it and determine what they're going to do from there. I don't know whether it's going to pass or not, but that's up to the legislature in terms of the Clean Heat Standard.
What about the Global Warming Solutions?
I think there needs to be changes to that. And I don't want to get ahead of our policy, but I've said it along the campaign trail. I said it in other venues. I think there needs to be some changes. Realization. We need to be aware of what we can do, what we can't, and what we can accomplish and what we can't, and just be more sensitive to the needs of Vermonters. All right, thank you very much.